Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent, and this is another episode of the Meaningful Shit Show. This is take 3. First take always is too shitty. The second take is too put together, and I hope that this will be in the Goldilocks zone. A little bit more ad-libbing, but of course also focusing on everything that I've prepared, because it's quite a bit. And today's episode is about the human brain and how it adapts to trauma. If you've seen my introduction episode, I do want to talk about trauma, and I noticed that I haven't talked about it too much. So I want to talk about trauma, about how the same adaptations that once understood can be unwound, like the trauma adaptations. And it's not just theory. Of course, I base it on a lot of practical research, and it's also a map of my own nervous system. So it's a personal episode laid over the science that finally made it make sense for me. So here's the path that we're going to take today. First, we're going to look how trauma wires the brain for survival, not from the perspective of a pathology or weakness, sickness, but as an intelligent biological adaptation. We'll start with early attachment, move into neglect, betrayal, and see how the brain fragments itself to stay alive, and what the problem about that is and what we'll do about it. Next, we'll examine what those adaptations turn into over time. So how a nervous system that's organized around that threat model, betrayal, that it can look functional on the outside, but it is relying on compulsive regulation, maladaptive regulation underneath. This is where addiction, overachievement, hyperdiscipline come in, for example. Then we'll turn towards integration, and this is one of the solutions, what it actually means to reconnect mind and body. We're going to talk about that disconnect, to be able to feel again without being overwhelmed, and to move from survival into something more coherent and chosen, and why that's important. Finally, we'll talk about gratitude. But not as a denial or positivity, but as a byproduct of this integration, trauma integration. A way of holding everything that happened without being defined by it. This is a heavy episode, but it's also a hopeful one. If you've ever wondered why your nervous system does what it does and whether it can change, this is the right episode for you. So let's dive in. Before we can heal, though, we must first understand the architecture of the emotional injury. When we talk about trauma responses, we're not discussing, again, character flaws, sign of weaknesses, disease. No, we're talking about a brilliant, albeit costly, survival strategy that our biology wires into our very being in the face of some overwhelming threat. To understand my own journey, I had to deconstruct how my young, developing brain adapted to an environment of profound neglect and danger, and I dove into a wealth of literature on it to understand. To make sense of what came later, we have to start very early. My story begins with a large absence. My biological mother died when I was an infant. It left a void where the most critical relationship in the human life is supposed to be. This wasn't just an emotional loss. It really was a neurobiological one. What does it mean? As a baby, my nervous system was not a self-contained unit. It was designed to exist in a dyad, to be regulated by another. This is a concept, well-known concept, by developmental psychologist Tronick, and it's called co-regulation. His mutual regulation model shows us that an infant's brain relies on a responsive caregiver to manage distress, to soothe fear, and to amplify joy when it's safe. This back and forth, that is what builds a child's capacity to eventually manage their own states. But Tronick's work also reveals this crucial detail. A healthy relationship isn't one of perfect constant synchrony. It's one that's good at repairing the inevitable moments of mismatch, the missed cues, delayed responses. So the core of the injury for me wasn't just the absence of a caregiver. It was a chronic state of mismatch without repair. Without that dance of connection and reparation, my infant brain was forced into a premature and costly form of autoregulation. I had to turn inward, developing rudimentary poor strategies to manage overwhelming terror, loneliness, and confusion, mostly on my own. My nervous system had to become its own parent. This early blueprint of radical self reliance, born from a severed connection like that, became the foundation for navigating the betrayals, the disappointments that were still to come in the rest of my life. What followed for me wasn't, anything drastic like domestic violence or something like that. It was something much more quieter, in some ways harder to see. Most of the childhood was shaped by neglect. Some things were emphasized: academics, being good at school, manners. And of course, those mattered. Those are useful. But emotionally, developmentally, many essentials were missing. Researcher Jennifer Freyd offers actually a very handy framework to make sense of this. In her book Betrayal Trauma Therapy, she explains that when a child depends on for their survival, is also the source of harm, active or passive, the child faces an impossible dilemma. To fully recognize the danger would threaten the attachment itself. And without attachment, this attachment, like survival, would be at risk. You're very dependent. So the mind does something drastic and brilliant. It creates a split. Your awareness is compartmentalized. This isn't forgetting, it's a life-preserving maneuver. So in my case, that split took the form of what she refers to as the day-night child. This is very recognizable to me. The day child was the functional and compliant one, able to maintain this attachment, keep a roof over my head, play along with the games, The night child was sent elsewhere in my situation, literally. My room was in an unheated attic, physically removed from the rest of the house. It became the place where unmet needs, fear, and isolation could exist out of sight, contained so that attachment below could continue uninterrupted. So it was a very split existence. It's funny to think back of. Like it felt very fragmented, where some of the things that you share with the rest of the world seemed pretty normal, pretty standard. But then there was another side that wasn't really recognized during the day. It was like sort of shoved under the rug. And it wasn't really a choice or a personality trait. This is documented as the brain's solution to really an impossible problem. How would you stay attached to the people that you depend on for your survival while surviving their absence, like where they're dropping the ball? And this internal split, this architecture of not knowing, it didn't really remain just psychological. It doesn't remain psychological. It shapes your development itself. So what I later understood is that many of the things I interpreted as personal failure as a child were actually signs of a nervous system that just never received the conditions to properly organize itself. To understand it, we have to look at the brainstem. So in the research of Dr. Bruce Perry, he explains that this primitive area controls housekeeping, functions like heart rate, elimination. To organize properly, the brainstem needs rhythmic, patterned care, which you normally get when you're an infant and toddler. And in the case of my childhood, my system never received that consistent regulation required to manage these basic rhythms. The internal clock was never properly set. And simultaneously, to endure the chronic neglect later, I had to learn not to feel or to compartmentalize that. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk describes interoception as the ability to sense our internal state, managed by the insula. This is a deep brain structure located within the lateral sulcus, separating the frontal and the parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. So, to survive the lack of hygiene, cold, abandonment, my brain shut down those sensory pathways. I successfully numbed the emotional pain, but the cost was losing physical awareness. Underneath this was a state of dorsal vagal collapse, a metabolic shutdown to preserve energy when escape is impossible. This is a nervous system forcing itself to numb just to survive. Those early adaptations didn't disappear, they evolved. So, as a teenager, I developed the various coping behaviors to deal with this situation, find relief, stimulation, most notably compulsive use of pornography. These weren't moral failings and well documented in these situations. They were desperate and neurobiological terms, logical attempts to regulate a profoundly dysregulated nervous system. That's way to regulate. Early adversity leaves long-term biological imprints. The Handbook of Infant Mental Health documents how chronic stress disrupts the HPA axis. This is the body's central stress response system. And the result is what Bessel van der Kolk calls an overwhelming states of arousal. There's a deeper mechanism, though. In situations of neglect and abuse, a child is often helpless and immobilized. The normal fight or flight response is blocked. We talked about this. Stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, they are released, priming the body for action that actually never comes. The energy has nowhere to go. In absence of a safe regulating relationship, I found a neurochemical one. Addiction provided, or compulsive use provided, temporary solution. Dopamine-driven reward paired with an opioid-like numbing. Chemical answer to a biological problem that had been wired in early. What fires together wires together. I learned that later when I began dismantling these strategies in various types of therapy groups. They were strategies for survival, but survival is not the same as living your full life. Moving from one to the other required really like a fundamental break with the world that I thought that I came to understand. There's a profound paradox at the heart of healing from trauma, that from the ashes of our deepest suffering, our greatest strengths can emerge. And this is not about romanticizing the pain. It's about recognizing that the very tools we forged to survive can, with intention, be repurposed productively into assets for a thriving life instead of being maladaptive. The next part of the story is about that shift from merely enduring to actively growing, thriving. So it's where the story shifts from survival to something else. In young adulthood, I appear to be a model of success. I suddenly became highly disciplined, built a career, achieved financial stability, with relentless focus. Success was regulating to me. It soothed the nervous system that had learned to equate stability with safety. So on the outside, I was functional, even impressively so. That doesn't mean that it was quite true on the inside, that everything was integrated, because I would say on the inside, the night child we spoke about earlier was still active, acting out, acting up. Anxiety hummed beneath every accomplishment. It's manageable only as long as the momentum carried me forward, right? Like anxiety isn't terrible sometimes to achieve goals, but then you need the next and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing because it never stops. So achievement did let me live in today and tomorrow to have something to chase against without having to look back. But researchers like Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun describe post-traumatic growth as emerging from a seismic disruption of the assumptive world, the basic belief that life is safe, people are trustworthy, and the future is predictable. For me, those assumptions were never built in the first place. That absence became sort of a forced opportunity because I didn't really have that foundation to return to. I had to construct a world from scratch, brick by brick, using some of the same survival tools that I've learned in the attic. And we've talked about this in other episodes. I will give an overview towards the end of the episode. All right. So, the hyper discipline that my stepmother's Spartan environment demanded did turn into my professional work ethic. The radical self reliance that I learned in isolation became my capacity for independent achievement. The intense focus on money, born from a distaste for instability, became actually a successful tool for creating security. They were survival skills repurposed as strengths. This phenomenon is captured in Ronnie Jane of Bullman's concept psychological preparedness. While early trauma is undeniably damaging, enduring it can create a unique capacity to navigate future stressors. It makes sense if you think about it. Having survived the worst, lesser challenges then seem manageable. It's kind of a psychological inoculation, bought at a terrible price, of course. But strength without integration is just another form of armor. You're not really truly showing yourself. So the final step was not to build higher walls, but actually to open things up, to integrate. Speaking of integration, the core task of healing is what the trauma research says from trauma is integration. The word is crucial. It does not mean forgetting. It doesn't mean erasing the past. Doesn't mean denying the past. It means weaving the fragmented pieces of the self, like both the high-functioning day child and the terrified night child, into a single coherent story. It is the process of becoming whole again. Integration isn't optional in trauma recovery. When survival requires fragmentation, this is true. Healing requires coherence. It's the next step. Without it, the past continues to operate implicitly outside of your awareness, shaping behavior, meaning, or lack of meaning. The story of the past simply always exists. It's either implicit, then it's unpruned, or it's tended, like a beautiful rose bush or a bonsai tree. It's how we humans give purpose and meaning to our lives through our stories and our connections to humans, alive and dead, real and imaginary. The central thesis of Besser van der Kolk's work, and this is basically PTSD Bible that actually put PTSD as a diagnosis on the map. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. So what's the central thesis there? The central thesis is that trauma is not stored as a neat linear narrative. It's stored as visceral fragments. The tightness in your chest, the knot in your stomach, the trapped energy of a survival response that was never discharged. These are held in nonverbal, emotional parts of the brain. For years, I had been a brilliant mind disconnected from a terrified body. Like very poor body awareness, very poor integration. Integration then is the process of reconnecting with these bodily sensations in a context of safety. It meant learning to feel the legacy of the addict, the tension, the anxiety, the fear, without being hijacked by it. It's about finally allowing that stored energy to be felt, processed, and released. It meant allowing the night child to finally have a voice, to be held and soothed by the competent adult, the day child, instead of being shunned. It's slow and painstaking work, and you have to teach your body that the war is over. This internal reconnection is what finally allows for the creation of a new cohesive life story. My journey from the maladaptive coping of my teenage years to the now of my present life has been a movement from fragmentation to cohesion. This is the ultimate expression of post-traumatic growth. It's not just about telling a story. It's what Jennifer Freyd calls, get out your notepads here, boys and girls, the episodic interpretation and integration of previously disjointed sensory and affective memories. Let's do that again. The episodic interpretation and integration of previously disjointed sensory and affective memories. All right, what does that mean? It is the work of assembling a coherent narrative from the raw data of survival. Sensory fragment, emotional shards that were once too dangerous to know, put away, can't access it. This new story doesn't ignore the darkness. It acknowledges it. It honors the survival it required. It integrates it into a larger narrative of resilience, meaning, purpose, strength. But there's one final piece of this puzzle that's often misunderstood and can either be a tool of denial or a powerful catalyst for healing, and it's gratitude. I want to take a moment to address what I think a complex and what I mostly think an often misused concept of gratitude in trauma recovery, gratitude in general. It's critical that we distinguish between the harmful pressure of toxic positivity and a truly functional, resilient form of gratitude that can aid healing. I feel like lots of us don't really understand gratitude. Gratitude is not the list we make that Oprah tells us to make, like a problem, like we're solving for X. The gratitude lies in the process itself. As an artifact, the list is useless. Feeling the gratitude where it's at, and that can be hard if we're safely living in our heads instead of having access to our bodies where we can actually feel that gratitude. It's a bodily sensation. Well, toxic positivity is just the denial of pain. It's much more heady. It's the good vibes only mentality that demands we suppress our difficult but authentic emotions. For trauma survivor, this is an act of violence. It demands that we abandon the parts of ourselves that are still hurting, reinforcing the original fragmentation to begin with. Functional gratitude, in contrast, is an authentic appreciation that can coexist with this pain, with the grief, with the anger. As research highlighted in the Science of Gratitude white paper shows, genuine gratitude is consistently linked to resilience, not denial. It doesn't require you to ignore or sugarcoat the negative. It allows you to also see the positive. The foundation of this functional gratitude lies in what psychologist Ronnie Jane F. Bullman calls existential reevaluation. Trauma forces you to confront the fragility of life, the reality of suffering, head on. By fully acknowledging this vulnerability, you can paradoxically develop a heightened, more profound appreciation for this existence itself. It's not about being grateful for the trauma. I will never be grateful for the loss that I experienced, the neglect that I experienced, but I can be grateful for the possibilities that opened up after the disaster, the possibilities that otherwise I would never have had. The chance to build a new life, for example, to forge my own meaning, to become the person that I am today. It is gratitude for what is, not a forced thankfulness for what was. To make this distinction clear, I have an analogy exercise for you. It's the green square, red circle. Think of it in this way. The abuse, the loss, the neglect is the red circle. It is harmful, it is toxic, it's unequivocally bad. You don't want to wish that on your worst enemy. There's nothing to be grateful inside that circle, ever. But the resilience, strength, compassion, wisdom that I built in response to that abuse is in a green square around that. I can be profoundly and authentically grateful for the green square of my resilience, my career, independence, the life that I've built, the mental health friends, without ever being grateful for the red circle of loss and abuse that made it necessary. And this is not a silver lining. A silver lining implies that the cloud itself had a good part. The red circle has no good parts. Let's get that straight. The green circle is something I built separately from the rubble long after the storm passed. And what a good thing to remember is that, again, it's I built that. That's something that I personally did. That's what where I can hang my head on versus the things that happen to you. Reminds me of owner versus victim mentality as well, where you can get stuck in a victim mentality of, oh, well, all these things are happening to me, and now I'm, you know, broken, or it can never be, like, whatever. That's that pushes everything into like an outside locus of control versus the owner mentality of taking radical responsibility for all of these things. They're very related concepts. So this both and thinking, that is basically the hallmark of the integration I'm talking about. It's the ability to hold the two opposing truths at once. The trauma was terrible. The person I became, in spite of it, is worthy and wonderful, and I'm grateful for. The journey from a fragmented survival architecture to an integrated cohesive self is long and difficult. It's the work of a lifetime. And I have a fun analogy. The Japanese have an art form called Kintsugi. They repair broken pottery by mending the cracks with a lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy here is that the piece becomes more valuable, more beautiful because it was broken. The cracks become like a nice detail, like basically something that makes the pot special. Similarly, healing from trauma is not about trying to erase and hide the cracks and pretend that the break never happened. It is about illuminating these cracks with the goal of self awareness, self compassion, meaning generation. The goal is not to return to who you were before. So, the trauma is a part of your story, but it doesn't have to be the end of your story. It doesn't mean that now your life is like if life is over. Now there's nothing meaningful, useful, whatever you can do with your life. Now, it's not like that. The potential for healing, for growth, and for cohesion is real, and it's within us all that carry trauma. All right, heavy stuff. This is it. This is it for this episode of the Meaningful Shit Show. Today we looked at survival, its logic, its cost, what it takes to unwind it, but as a not as a pathology, not, but as a biology. How does it biologically beautifully work? If this episode resonated, there are a few earlier conversations in my feed that go deeper into related territory, addiction as regulation, meaning after collapse, and what happens when acceptance becomes the turning point. Let me go through them. There's episode 13, Breaking Habits, the real deal on addiction and recovery. So you can access that by going to tms.show/13. It's a focused dive into the neurobiology and psychology of compulsive patterns and how healing actually happens. So similar to what I'm talking about here. And if we want to get a little bit more philosophical, which I love, is episode 14. So that's tms.show/14. How nihilism, absurdism, and existentialism made me happier. About the meaning work after trauma and the philosophy of rebuilding a coherent life. This is very important. I mentioned that like somewhere, in the first half of the episode, that after trauma, you oftentimes find that your worldview collapsed. The truth that you were clinging to, that safe world and people are decent and etc. That suddenly isn't there, or even the ideas that have been passed down to you by your culture. And this is where I talk about in this episode, where I basically deconstructed a lot of these things that I was brought up with, these beliefs that were trauma informed for me, and found myself in a basically philosophical clearing, having burned everything to the ground. It sounds very aggressive, but having deconstructed everything and choosing how do you rebuild a coherent life? What's the web of beliefs? What are the values that you're going to live your life around? Because, you know, there's a choice for you to recreate that. It's a very powerful episode, I think. We have episode 20 where I go, so that's tms.show/20. The gift of rock bottom. That's where I talk about the work of Kierkegaard, again, about nihilism and radical acceptance. It's about the turning point where acceptance becomes the soil for growth. That sometimes, in order to, grow, we must first sink. We must first, not struggle to not get to the bottom, because the bottom, in a way, is safe. We know what the bottom is. We can use it as a launching pad. All right. So if this episode landed for you, those conversations will deepen and extend these ideas. Thank you so much for listening. This was an episode that was a lot of work for me, both doing the research, both reflecting on all of the things that I read. It was an emotional process to go through. I've done tons of work in like the past decades on trauma recovery. This is part of the reason I like to talk about it in this podcast. But still, every time that you go through this, you discover new things, you discover new models. You go through the process again of like looking at some of the things that happen, and that's painful every time. And actually, in the process of editing this episode, I learned a bunch as well. And first, this episode was a lot more raw, where in a way it's cathartic for me to be able to speak my truth, to speak some of the things, the bad things that happened to me. But what I realized with the help of editors, AI editors as well, is that it's very important to make sure to not burden the audience in this situation with that. I mean, it can't just be like trauma dumping on y'all, and be because then you have to halt that. So it's very important to underline as well. It's like, okay, like bad things happen to me, but what happened with, like, I'm okay now, by the way. Like, my life is in the best state that it has ever been. I am honestly, truly, incredibly grateful to be able to do this work, honestly, and all the other work that I'm doing, the connections that I have with the people that I have. But yeah, it definitely was a journey to be able to really go into some of these personal stories, to read about some of the things on, the models. Like, let's say I clearly have gone, the scripted content has ended. But if I read the models, like you read the research on what tends to happen with people that are experience certain type of trauma, and then especially if you look at infants, it's interesting to see the parallels for me, because for some reason, like, we always consider ourselves, or at least I do, as sort of unique. We have our unique stories, and of course that's still true, and we do. And also there are, it's interesting to see someone telling, oh yeah, but this is the pattern, and there is a night child and a day child. And at first, the the concept was new to me, in the sense of like the way that Jennifer Freight exactly put it, but the concept is not like, that's like kind of how I look at that. I had different words for it in the past, have different terms for it in the past, more like in the adult child kind of thing. But they're good concepts to get to know. And of course, the goal is of diving into a rat hole like this, is that I also come out better, because the last thing I want to do to me, or in this case also I have to think about the audience as well, is to create more for myself to hold, or for the audience to hold. And yeah, so there's a bunch of work that went into that as well, to make sure that I feel that it had a nice, like, conclusion to it. And although that it does, as a conclusion, I also still want to underline, I do think that in general, it's kind of like the view that I have on mental health is that it is something that is lifelong work, right? Even if you grew up without, terrible loss and neglect and whatever things, abuse happening to you. I think one of the things that are in the green square for me is because my ground was clearly not satisfactory. I think that my advantage was that I've had to do a lot more of that existential work of breaking down structures because they didn't really, the lessons that I had been handed, they were not working for me. So, although in my early adolescence, as I mentioned, I followed the rules very well. I'm a very good rule follower, but you have to trust the rule book that's been handed to you. So, and I discovered that there's just certain things that were handed down to me, how to regulate emotions, how to talk about vulnerable things. This was never taught to me. And with the baggage that I got, that created basically sort of an untenable situation, an inability to really create deep connections as well, because there was always an hidden side, the night child, basically. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you the next episode. So it was the Meaningful Shit Show, and I was your host, Vincent. All right. See you next time. Thanks.